What truth could unravel beneath the gilded veil of matrimony, when the hourglass of secrecy finally empties its last grain? What mask can a man wear before it cracks, revealing bloodlines that the world was never meant to see? It was the spring of 1849, when the magnolias of Charleston swelled white as ivory against skies the color of ash. The city prepared itself for a wedding, not just a union of two young hearts, but a merging of fortunes, of families, of prestige woven into the very backbone of Southern society. The bride, Eleanor Whitmore, stood as a picture of grace and lineage. She was the daughter of Judge Whitmore, a man whose rulings had shaped the destiny of countless men, women, and slaves in South Carolina. To marry into her bloodline was to secure a place at the table of power, to walk in corridors lined with oil portraits of ancestors and silver polished until it gleamed like moonlight. Her groom was Nathaniel Harrow, a young man of striking appearance, tall, composed, with the kind of face that drew admiration at galas and envy in courtrooms. He carried himself with the solemn air of nobility, and in Charleston's parlors his name had become a whisper of admiration. The Whitmores welcomed him, not simply for his charm, but for the mystery that seemed to encircle him. Nathaniel spoke little of his past, offering fragments of a story about distant cousins, a father who had died, and a plantation lost to debts. He wore his silence like a cloak, and few pressed further. The Whitmores never asked the questions they should have asked. For to question too deeply might stir truths best left buried. The morning of the wedding rose with the scent of candle wax and honeysuckle. Servants scurried through the halls of the Whitmore estate, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs. The great dining hall had been converted into a cathedral of luxury, crystal chandeliers casting golden light upon silk ribbons, tables groaning under the weight of sugared confections and imported wine. But in the corners, behind the fluttering veils and perfumed corsages, a different murmur moved, the whispers of the house slaves, who carried more than trays and linens. They carried memory. They carried knowledge. In the back corridors of the estate, where shadows pooled against brick and iron, one woman sat in silence. Her name was Lila. Her hands were lined with calluses from decades of servitude, but her eyes carried the weight of a secret no jewel could outshine. For once, long ago, she had been more than a servant. She had been a mother. And the groom, dressed in linen and lace, standing before the mirror as he adjusted his cravat, was her son. The truth had been buried in whispers and exchanged glances for 2 decades. Nathaniel had been born not in the great house, but in the small cabin by the fields, the product of a fleeting cruelty from a master who denied his own child. As an infant, Nathaniel had been whisked away by a benefactor who believed the boy might pass into society's ranks if raised apart from the soil that branded him. Lila had been forbidden to speak of him, her body enslaved, her motherhood silenced. But the past, like an ember, does not die. It smolders, waiting for a breath to awaken flame. As the carriages lined the Whitmore gates, as guests stepped down in their gowns and top hats, as violins hummed beneath the high arches, a storm gathered unseen. The wedding day would not end with vows and celebration. It would end with revelation. For in that hall of chandeliers, before judge and preacher, before bride and groom, the name of Nathaniel Harrow would be stripped bare. His lineage would be laid upon the altar of shame. And every eye would see him not as groom, but as the son of a slave. The question was not if the secret would break. The question was who would dare to break it, and why. By noon, the air was thick with heat. Guests fanned themselves with ivory handles, sipping champagne as their eyes darted toward the grand staircase where Eleanor would soon descend. Nathaniel stood at the altar, hands folded, gaze steady, but beneath his calm exterior his pulse throbbed like a drum. Somewhere in the crowd, a figure lingered who should not have been there, a woman in plain garb, her face half shadowed by a bonnet. Lila. She had not been invited. But she had come. And she had not come empty-handed. The hourglass had run dry. The church bells tolled, their solemn chimes rolling across Charleston like a warning few recognized. The Whitmore estate was a hive of music and laughter, ribbons fluttering from columns, servants darting with trays of sugared almonds and champagne. Yet beneath the laughter lay something else, a hush, a tension like silk stretched too tight. Nathaniel Harrow stood near the altar, his posture straight as carved oak, every movement precise, calculated. He had trained himself for this day, not just in matters of love but in the theater of appearances. He believed if he smiled just enough, if he spoke softly, if he carried the poise of nobility, no one would ever think to question the shadows that clung to his past. But shadows have a way of stepping into the light. Across the hall, Eleanor Whitmore's beauty gleamed beneath her veil. She descended the staircase with the grace of a swan, her gown a cascade of white silk that shimmered like moonlight. Gasps of admiration rippled through the guests. She was, in that moment, the embodiment of Southern wealth and promise. Yet even Eleanor, beneath the powder and the pearls, sensed something strange. She had seen the way Nathaniel avoided questions about his childhood, how his smile stiffened whenever family histories were discussed. Love blinded her, but unease gnawed quietly, waiting. Among the guests stood a man whose presence turned heads, Reverend Cole, an aging preacher with a face carved by suspicion. He was no stranger to Charleston's whispers, and his eyes followed Nathaniel with unsettling interest. His hand rested not upon a Bible alone but upon the weight of knowledge he had carried for years, the rumor that Nathaniel Harrow was no Harrow at all, but the son of a slave woman who once worked the fields outside the city. And then there was Lila. She kept to the shadows of the hall, her bonnet drawn low, her hands twisting the folds of her plain dress. She had not seen her son in years, not since he was carried away as an infant, yet she knew him at once. His jaw, his eyes, they were her own. Her heart burned to cry out his name, to claim him, to embrace him as only a mother could. But she knew what such a truth meant in 1849 Charleston. For Nathaniel, it meant ruin. For Eleanor, it meant disgrace. For herself, it meant punishment worse than chains. Still, Lila carried something within her that would not allow silence, a letter. The letter had been written years ago by Nathaniel's first master, a document meant never to surface, confessing in bitter ink the crime he had committed against her, and acknowledging Nathaniel as his son. Lila had hidden it, preserved it, waited. Now, on the day of Nathaniel's triumph, her silence was no longer protection. It was betrayal. As the bride took her place beside the groom, as the preacher cleared his throat, as the music dwindled into quiet, the ceremony began. Dearly beloved, Reverend Cole's voice boomed, steady but sharp. He spoke of union, of sacred bonds, of promises before God. But even as the words fell, his eyes never left Nathaniel. The preacher's pause stretched longer than needed, his lips curving as though he relished what was to come. For Reverend Cole was not only a man of God, he was a man of judgment. And secrets, to him, were sins demanding exposure. At the back of the hall, whispers began. Two older matrons in silk gowns leaned toward one another, murmuring about Nathaniel's uncanny resemblance to a slave boy who had vanished years ago. A planter's wife recalled a story of a woman named Lila, forced to give up her child. Another muttered about how Harrow blood had never run so dark around the eyes. The rumor was moving, uncoiling like a serpent through the crowd. Eleanor's mother, seated in the front row, stiffened. She noticed it first in Nathaniel's jaw, the way he clenched his teeth at the murmur. She glanced at her daughter, radiant in silk and innocence, and a shiver ran through her. The preacher raised his hand. If any here have cause to show why this man and this woman should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The hall fell silent. A silence so thick it seemed to crush the air from the lungs of those within. Eleanor's hand trembled within Nathaniel's. He tightened his grip, willing her calm. But then, a voice. Low. Steady. Feminine. I have cause. The crowd gasped, every head turning toward the back. There, from the shadows, Lila stepped forward, her bonnet slipping back to reveal eyes bright with fire and grief. The hall erupted in murmurs. A slave woman, someone hissed. What business has she here? Reverend Cole's face curved into something between triumph and grim duty. Speak, woman, he commanded, his voice echoing. Lila's hands shook as she reached into her dress, pulling free the folded letter. She held it aloft, her voice breaking as she cried, This man, your groom, Nathaniel Harrow, is my son. Born of me, a slave in Charleston, and of your master who denied him. His blood is mine, and his lineage is the truth you would rather bury than face. Gasps cut through the air like a blade. Eleanor staggered, her veil trembling as she turned to her groom. Nathaniel's face drained of color, his breath gone. The preacher's hands slammed upon the altar. The crowd erupted into chaos, men shouting, women fanning themselves to keep from fainting, whispers like a swarm of bees. Eleanor's voice rose, trembling, desperate. Nathaniel, is it true? And Nathaniel, with every eye upon him, every whisper cutting into his skin like a lash, felt his carefully constructed life collapse. The truth he had buried in silence for 2 decades now stood in flesh and ink before him. His mother. His blood. His shame. And the wedding, once a promise of unity, had become a theater of exposure. The veil had lifted, not from the bride, but from the groom. The letter trembled in Lila's hand as though the ink itself burned her fingers. Gasps and cries tore through the Whitmore hall like storm winds rattling shutters. Chandeliers swayed as if disturbed by unseen hands. The wedding, dressed in silks and white roses, had curdled into a trial. Nathaniel stood frozen, his breath trapped in his chest. For 20 years he had built walls of silence around his past, brick by brick, lie by lie. Now those walls cracked, crumbled, and fell in the space of a single heartbeat. The guests who had once bowed in respect now turned their faces, whispering venom into their lace gloves. Eleanor clutched her gown, her white-gloved fingers trembling as though she held shards of glass. Nathaniel, she whispered again, her voice hollow, searching for an answer. Say it is false. Say it is slander. But Nathaniel could not. His lips parted, yet no words came. His silence was a confession more damning than speech. Lila, her eyes red but unyielding, raised the letter high. You may scorn me. You may call me nothing but a slave. But you cannot silence truth. This man was born of me, and the blood you thought pure is stained with mine. The crowd reeled. Eleanor's father, Judge Whitmore, rose to his feet with a thunderous crash of his cane against the floor. His voice cut through the clamor like a whip. Enough. This is an outrage. Remove her. Remove this woman from this house at once. 2 men stepped forward, but Reverend Cole lifted his hand, halting them. His eyes glittered, cold and merciless. No, he said. The Lord commands truth above all. If what she speaks is truth, it cannot be silenced. It must be faced. Nathaniel's chest heaved. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing into him. The hall was no longer a sanctuary but a scaffold. At last, his voice broke free, ragged, torn from his throat. It is true. The words dropped heavy into the silence. Like stones in still water, they sent ripples of horror through the crowd. Women gasped, men muttered, the air shuddered with disbelief. Eleanor staggered back as though struck, her veil slipping from her head, her face pale as bone. You lied to me, she whispered. Her voice was neither rage nor sorrow but something deeper, a hollow shattering of trust. You lied to all of us. Nathaniel reached for her, desperate. Eleanor, I only wanted to be worthy of you. I only wanted. Worthy? She recoiled, her voice sharp as broken glass. You built our love on falsehood. You thought yourself noble, yet you deceived me, deceived my family, deceived God himself. The letter fell from Lila's trembling fingers to the floor. It lay there, stark and damning, its ink glistening in the candlelight like blood. The guests surged with whispers. Some hissed, fraud, others murmured, abomination. The weight of centuries pressed down, the cruel law of the South where bloodlines were chains and purity the currency of power. Judge Whitmore thundered again. This union is forbidden. It is void. You, Nathaniel Harrow, are no gentleman. You are a fraud, the son of a slave. You will never enter this family. Nathaniel staggered back as though struck by a hammer. His dream shattered. The life he had built turned to dust in his hands. Eleanor turned her face away, her veil fallen to the floor like discarded innocence. She could not look at him. She would never look at him again. For a moment, silence stretched. Then laughter, sharp, cruel, echoed from the back of the hall. A wealthy planter, drunk on champagne, sneered. "So this is your golden groom? The Harrow heir? No better than the fields he was born from." Rage flickered in Nathaniel's chest, but it was hollow, futile. The truth was a noose around his neck, and every whisper pulled it tighter. Lila stepped forward, her eyes locked on her son. "Nathaniel," she said softly, though her voice carried in the silence. "You are not your shame. You are mine. You are flesh of my flesh. No matter what they call you, you are my child." But Nathaniel turned from her. He could not bear her gaze, could not bear the pity, could not bear the reminder of the blood he had tried so long to bury. His voice broke. "Why now, mother? Why today?" Tears streamed down her face. "Because lies grow like weeds, and one day they strangle even the strongest tree. I could not let you bind another life in falsehood." The hall had become a tomb. The music had died, the roses wilted in their perfume, the champagne soured on untouched lips. Nathaniel tore the ring from his finger, the band that would never rest upon Eleanor's hand. He let it fall, a hollow sound against the floor. "Then it is done," he whispered. "My life, my love, everything. Done." He turned and walked from the hall. No one stopped him. No one followed. The doors closed behind him with the weight of a coffin lid. Eleanor collapsed into her mother's arms, her sobs muffled by lace and silk. The guests slowly dispersed, their whispers following like shadows into the night. And Lila? She stood alone, the letter at her feet, the truth exposed but her heart hollow. She had freed her son from a lie, but in doing so had bound him to a loneliness deeper than chains. Years later, the story of that wedding still haunted Charleston. Some whispered of Nathaniel Harrow, the groom who walked from the altar in disgrace. Some whispered of Lila, the slave who dared speak truth in a hall of lies. And some whispered of Eleanor Whitmore, who lived her life with a broken veil and a broken heart. But all agreed, that wedding was no union. It was an unmasking. And in 1849, when the candles burned low and the violins fell silent, Charleston remembered not love, not promise, but exposure. A truth so sharp it cut through lace, silk, and blood itself.